So good evening, dear beloved community. It's so wonderful to be together with everyone again. I hope each of you are doing well. Today is the 27th of September in the year 2020, and together with the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, we're beginning our new series of talks. I hope each of you is well wherever you find yourself at this moment in time. I'm very excited to be beginning this new series of talks. I was reflecting on which topic would be appropriate for the next period of time. And I also looked at the requests that people made in the survey that we sent out a number of months ago now. There's a number of wonderful topics in there, some of which we've already covered in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha. But looking at the topics, I just was feeling that there was something else that wanted to come forward. And so I continued to walk, I continued to sit, and I continued to look deeply into what was feeling like it wanted to come forth. And it was quite surprising. I felt a little tap on the shoulder. And so over the next few weeks, we'll be going into some of the most core ancient teachings of the Buddha. It seems to me that the most significant choice that we can make as practitioners is to choose to fully inhabit our experience, to show up for what is, whatever it is, with no excuses. This is a radical act, and it's a courageous act, to show up for what is without hiding anywhere, whether behind fear, behind views, or excuses. If I'm too tired, then being tired is what I show up for. If I'm in pain, experiencing pain is my teacher calling me. If I'm confused, then showing up with an open heart, an open mind and body to that very confusion is the way forward. Insight doesn't fall from the sky. Honestly, it would be great if it did, but rather wisdom begins to emerge through putting down roots into our experience just as it is, whatever it is, and in choosing not to run anymore. This choice of not running anymore is not a one-time thing, but it's a choice in each and every moment. And this is scary because we haven't got any of our usual strategies to hide behind anymore. This is wonderful because we'll discover by slowly opening to and letting go of all of our false securities that we find ourselves at home. The Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights, which we'll be exploring over the next few months, is a wonderful text. We'll be exploring it as well as its companion, the chapter on crossing to the other shore, Parayanavagga. And they're considered to be among the earliest recorded teachings. They're often considered to be among the Buddha's first and core teachings. The Book of Eights itself is a very significant text, and it offers us central teachings of early Buddhism in a very raw form. In this text, we find the Buddha's teachings pared down, really stripped down to their most essential elements. That being said, sadly for me, and perhaps for some of you, there are no lists. There's no mention of the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path, the teachings that are really considered to be the essence of what was later called Buddhism. There's no four foundations of mindfulness, no 7 factors of awakening, and so on. Rather, in this pithy text, we find the seeds that later blossomed into the fully developed teachings of Buddhism. I know what you're thinking. Brother Fawai, you've just spent 6 months teaching all of these things, the Noble Eightfold Path, the 7 factors of awakening, the 4 Noble Truths, and 4 nutriments, and so on, the 5 hindrances. And now you're bringing us to a text that doesn't even mention these things? Why? Well, my question to you is, why not? I wanted to invite us all to send a taproot down into the very source, It's by sending a taproot down into the very source, into that deep water table, that we'll be able to receive nourishment and to see how these essential early teachings of the Buddha blossomed into so many beautiful forms that we experience today. The absence of standardized or even systematic teachings is one reason that the Book of Eights is easy to overlook. It's also easy to overlook this text if we're looking for a text that has a very devotional focus. Many scholars believe that this text was composed really early, perhaps in the first years of the Buddha's teaching career. We know that the Buddha taught for around 45 years, and some consider this text that we'll be exploring over the next few months one of the earliest surviving teachings of the Buddha. There's no references in this text to a settled monastic community, which indicates that it might have been composed quite early after the Buddha's awakening, while he and his fellow monastics were still wandering quite a bit. And another interesting fact about this text is that it is mentioned in a number of other later Buddhist sutras. So this text that we'll be looking at is rich and profound, and it's multi-layered. Even though each poem, sort of like me, is short and quite to the point. The Book of Eights, the Akakavagga, is the 4th chapter of the Sutta Nipata, and it contains 16 poems, 16 verses. And they cover a number of key topics, but one of the key themes, the main themes in these 16 poems, is a focus on the 4 types of clinging. Clinging to sensual desires, which we've explored a little in earlier talks, clinging to views, to habits, to practices and precepts, and to ideas of the self. We'll touch on each of these themes a little later. The text itself, as short as it is, contains a radical message that offers an invitation, I feel, maybe even a challenge. At some moments in this text, it almost has a sense of a mic drop to each of us to stop messing around and to cultivate and live within a deep sense of peace in each and every moment, right here and right now. Not sometime later, but in the here and the now. One thing you'll notice as we explore this text is that within these verses, reality is not divided into a worldly realm, an everyday realm, and some realm that's described as transcendent, that's separate from our everyday life. This is a wonderful aspect of this text, and one of the reasons that I fell in love with it. It's very grounded, very rooted, and these verses remind us that peace, everyday peace, and the peace of liberation is to be touched right here and right now. This text is focused on using our daily life as our practice, and the 16 poems in this collection are direct infusions of wisdom, of insight from the point of view of someone who has woken up to reality, has woken up to their real situation. And they're a reminder that real wisdom, real insight is immediately useful. It's immediately applicable. And it's also effective. Coming from that perspective, it has to be said, there's a bit of a paradoxical Zen flavor to some of the poems in this collection that we'll discover as we go through the text. These verses don't propose a teaching or a theory that's meant to be seen as superior or better in some way to other teachings. Instead, we're offered a direct and a simple approach for cultivating peace without being covered over by a whole lot of dogma and ideology. They're incredibly direct and heartfelt. I think I've shared before in an earlier talk that one of the most important teachings I ever received in my spiritual life, not to mention my monastic life, was from one of our elder monks, Teyaktan, who was giving our fine manner class. And in the middle of the class, when I was a novice, he said to all of us, we were quite young back then, he said, whatever you do in your spiritual life, don't cover yourself over with a whole lot of bells and incense. So we have that sense in this collection that this collection of teachings is not covered over with a whole lot of bells and incense. It's the direct infusion of insight, a direct invitation for each one of us to do our work. I mentioned earlier about peace. In Pali, the word peace is santi. In Sanskrit, which some of us will be more familiar with, it's shanti. And the fact that in this collection, it's presented as the ultimate aim of practice. Santi or shanti, of course, means peace, but it's used to mean many things in the context of different verses in this text. Those of you who participated in the Metta Sutta class will remember that in the first line of the Metta Sutta, he or she who wants to attain peace, that peace in that first line of the Metta Sutta actually stands for liberation, for freedom, for nirvana, freedom from samsara. And we find this sense often in the text that we're going to be looking at over the next few months. While this text focuses on our own cultivation and invites us into touching and expressing that sense of peace, it also focuses on the collective situation as well. The possibility of touching this peace with a small p and then the peace with the big P right here and right now is what inspires the teachings and the practices in this text. The real value of this text, just like in Buddhism itself, are found in the fruits that they bring to those of us who are courageous enough to put them into practice, even a little bit. Instead of doctrines or dogmas or lists of things to memorize or believe, the Book of Eights offers us concrete practices for cultivating peace in our lives. And within the framework of the Book of Eights, it considers success when those results are seen in our lives by us, and of course by others, but primarily by us. I really like that. Rather than talking about something in the abstract, talking about mindfulness in the abstract or peace in the abstract or liberation in the abstract, the Book of Eights is really practical. As Tay has told us many times, with each and every teaching we encounter, it's so important to ask ourselves, how can I apply this teaching in such a way that it transforms my situation? The path of practice that we're offered in this text is described within the text both as qualities to nurture, qualities to cultivate, to generate in our lives, and qualities to let go of. So there's that sense of nurturing and also letting go that's carried throughout the entirety of the text. Peace and inclusiveness, of course, are emphasized as qualities to nurture, while grasping and craving and getting stuck in a rut or entrenched in our habits, our ideas, our perceptions, our ways of doing things, and not being willing to change, despite so many efforts of others, just doing the same thing and thinking it's the right thing over and over again, but it's just not. And quarreling are the qualities to be let go of. As we're reminded in Plum Village, happiness comes not from acquiring things or holding on to things, whether they're physical things or objects or habits or people or ideas, but rather from letting go on all levels. And in the context of this text, and in the larger context of Buddhist practice, the person who's able to do this, to cultivate and generate and realize this quality, is called a wise person, or a muni, a sage, in this chapter. As I mentioned before, a couple of times, the teachings in this text are presented straight up, without referring to a number of familiar formulations or lists that are associated with early Buddhism. In this text, we meet the Buddha as a human being without any of the supernatural powers or even titles such as Tathagata, the Thus Come One, or other amazing titles that we read in other texts. In fact, the title Buddha or World Honored One occur only once in this text. So why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? So as I mentioned earlier, overall we find 4 basic themes in this beautiful text. The first is awareness of and transforming sensual desire. The second is practices of letting go of views. The third is the qualities of a wise person, a muni or a sage. And the fourth is training to become wise, or practicing to develop the qualities of a wise one. So the first of those 4 themes is awareness of and transforming sensual desire. Desire is one of the main themes that is really woven through the entirety of this text. And this theme is actually the gateway into this text, since it's the theme of the very first poem in this collection, which is called, I wonder if you can guess what it's called, the Kamasutra. Whoa, I've never seen so many eyes light up, so many bright faces, so many faces that are interested in a Dhamma talk before. I should probably clarify, this is the Buddhist Kamasutra. Which is quite different from the Sanskrit text on maximizing sensual desire that some of the people with the bright eyes are probably thinking about. The text in this collection, the Kamasutra, is much shorter, and it must be said energetically quite different from the Sanskrit text, and it teaches the dangers found in the continual thirst for and running after sensual pleasures. We're reminded in this text that through this continual hunger and chasing after sensual pleasures, pleasant sights and sounds and smells, tastes, touches, and so on, we'll be eventually overwhelmed with danger and penetrated by suffering as water penetrates a cracked boat. So this is quite a different approach to the one that we're used to, and in many ways that our brain is hardwired to. The continual search outside for something, anything really to grasp onto. At its essence, the Buddhist practice is about disentanglement, about being radically free from being entangled in this world of samsara, or as we heard a few weeks back, entangled in tangles, in the round of suffering that we co-create, that we participate in. There's a beautiful Pali word that we encounter in this text. That's the word viveka. It can be translated in many ways, like mental seclusion, but also the capacity to distinguish between what is real and what is unreal. This quality is a very important quality in these core teachings and depends on letting go of grasping after sense pleasures, this continual pull, this continual search for something outside of ourselves. The solitude, the viveka, the quality of viveka that is mentioned in this text is more than just being physically alone. It has three aspects. The first is kaya viveka, which is a physical solitude, physical aloneness, is one level. But it also means the letting go of too much luxury, too much comfort, and letting that lull us into a false sense of complacency. The second is chitta viveka, which is mental solitude, meaning that quality of solitude that emerges when our mind slows down or stops its running after external things, thinking that our security or our sense of identity, all of these ways that we identify exists outside of ourselves based on external objects. So with this stage of viveka, our attention comes back within a little more and we become our own place of refuge. And then the third is upadhi viveka, which means the solitude of somebody who has transformed their suffering, who is being liberated, who is in the process of being liberated. Whenever I come across the word viveka, I'm reminded of the song in the Plum Village tradition that we sing quite often, being an island unto myself. If you know this song, then that song beautifully expresses this quality of viveka, of this sense of being deeply connected while being an island unto oneself, not pulled here and there anymore. There are references to this sensual desire throughout the text, sometimes in very gentle terms, and sometimes in quite strong terms, quite direct terms. But I think it's important to mention that as we go through the text, we'll notice something quite interesting, that the focus of the text is not that there's a problem necessarily with the sense inputs themselves, but the problem is with our habitual and blind responses to them, to our clinging, our tendency towards clinging to them, to grasping onto them in some way. The second of the themes is letting go of views. And this quality is very important to us in the order of interbeing. It's so important. It's one of the spirits of the order of interbeing to not cling on to not hold on to opinions, philosophies, doctrines, or even religious teachings, including views about ultimate truth. These are listed in the 14 mindfulness trainings of the Order of Interbeing, as well as in the Charter of the Order of Interbeing. In this text that we'll be looking at over the next few months, we're reminded that to find peace with a capital P, we should practice to recognize and to release all views without embracing or rejecting anything. For the astute among us, yes, this also means releasing views about letting go of views. There are a number of times in which the text reminds us of the danger in believing that our views or our beliefs are the most correct and that others are not quite up to scratch. And to me, this is a radical and a timely message. I feel like we need this message now more than ever. And perhaps this was one of the reasons that this text tapped me on the shoulder repeatedly. And I felt that it was really the right time to be able to present this text for everybody to practice with, to walk with, and to sit with over the next few months. This central message of letting go of views is so counter to our way of thinking and interacting on an individual and a collective level. The text itself includes a number of examples on the kinds of problems that can arise if we hold on to our views. There's a sense that if we have too many views, it leads to debates and arguments, and we end up flipping all over the place. If someone doesn't agree with our view, or if we're challenged in some way, we end up getting defensive rather than receiving an invitation. We say in the monastic world, receiving an admonishment openly and lovingly, we come back defensively with all kinds of excuses and justifications. We get flipped around all over the place. Overall, in this text, we'll notice a sense that from the insight of the Buddha, this raw insight that's presented, there's a sense that clinging to views doesn't lead to lasting peace. At most, at the very most, it can lead to a temporary ceasefire. This letting go of views might seem a bit contradictory somehow to those of us from a Buddhist background, because even putting aside Buddhism for the moment, most spiritual traditions are based on a particular set of views, a particular doctrine. So what are we left with when we lay down our views? And what do these views consist of, actually? This is a lifetime's work of discovery, of deep looking, and of letting go. But perhaps one place to start could be in the honey ball discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings, which is a wonderful discourse that speaks at some length to this. In that sutra, in that discourse, which would be fantastic for everybody to read over the next week or so, the Buddha shares that his teachings are not the basis for debates or disagreements. In fact, he says that his teaching is such a teaching with which one does not argue with anyone in the world. It's a teaching where a person who lives uninvolved with seeking and who is free of doubt, worry, and craving for any existence does not cling to concepts. This is what I teach. And so this excerpt from the Honeyball Sutra, the Honeyball Discourse, really reflects this theme of letting go of views and concepts and opinions in the Book of Eights that we'll be exploring over the next few months. This sense that liberation isn't found in doctrines or ideas, but rather through applying the practices that are offered so that we're able to let go of them and discover what's real and true for ourselves. The next theme is a description of a wise person, a wise one. So this third theme is the qualities of a wise or worthy one in Buddhism. A wise or worthy one in Buddhism, or in the framework of this text, is someone who's able to generate and realize peace for themselves, peace for ourselves. Again, peace with a small p, and peace with a big P, this peace of liberation. In some passages in this text, the word Brahman is used to describe a wise one. In India, a Brahmin is seen to be a person of the highest caste. In using the word Brahmin for a wise one, this text is reclaiming that term so that it doesn't apply in any way to the caste system anymore. So rather than by birth or by position in society and so on, a true worthy one, a true Brahmin in the context of Buddhism, and specifically in the context of this beautiful text, is someone who's let go of all of their grasping. This text emphasizes behavior rather than a spiritual attainment that's separate from how we live our lives. Instead, there's a really strong focus on everyday behaviors which concretely manifest the qualities that a person claims to possess. I have to say that this is really true also of the Plum Village tradition. We have very little time and very little attention for great claims of someone who can't take a mindful step or can't close a door mindfully and things. Mindfulness is as mindfulness does. That's really how we see things in Plum Village, and then how the Book of Eights also views the life of a practitioner. Mindfulness is as mindfulness does. In this way, it could be said that in this text, the seeds of engaged Buddhism, of our daily life as our spiritual practice, are waiting to sprout. There's one more aspect to mention. Many of us, when we think of those who've realized the way, who've attained liberation, which is one of the phrases that we hear often, we fall into that trap because of language, of thinking of attainments, of qualities that a person gets or develops as we continue along our spiritual path. This idea of getting enlightened, getting peaceful, getting happy, getting something. So if you have your antenna out, you'll be able to really pick up that this sense of getting something really falls into this realm of craving, of search, of this sense of lack that earlier we were sharing that the Book of Eights does not feel is part of the spiritual path. Here in the Book of Eights, in this text, a wise person doesn't get anything. Rather, they practice to let go of things. Let's have a sound of the bell. As everybody can probably tell, I love this text. I have been very much looking forward to sharing it with everybody. When I read this text a number of years ago for the first time, I was absolutely delighted. It felt like a heart sharing that was incredibly powerful, incredibly direct. And so I'm so happy to have the chance to be exploring it together with you. Then the next theme is the training to become wise, the training to develop the qualities of a muni, a wise one. So this theme of training. So while all of the poems in this text share what someone on the spiritual path should and perhaps shouldn't do, the last three poems focus specifically on the training itself. The overall text, the overall chapter, focuses on personal transformation and also taking responsibility for our own personal transformation. We read lines in the text such as engage fully in your own liberation, or a practitioner wouldn't look for peace from another. So in focusing on cultivating behaviors and qualities in a practitioner, this text doesn't emphasize outward religious practices that can be seen as steps toward, or as we would put in today's language, a checklist or a to-do list for attaining the qualities of a wise one. In fact, the Book of Eights clearly shares with us that in and of themselves, these outward observances and practices are not enough for becoming a person at peace. Rather, this text encourages us to simply behave like a wise person, to just do it already. In the earlier series of teachings that I offered on the Noble Eightfold Path and also on the Factors of Awakening, I shared that these practices were seen as both the way to and the very goal itself, the way to liberation or happiness or peace, however we define that liberation. And the very experience of that liberation, that peace, that happiness itself. Just as our teacher Tay has said that there's no way to peace. Peace is the way. This is the sense in this text overall. So for the first couple of weeks, the first couple of talks, the verses, the poems cover topics that we've looked at already, such as sensual desire, which we've looked at in terms of the hindrance, and we've also looked at in other aspects in terms of the Four Noble Truths and other aspects of the teachings of the last few months. But it'll be nice to go over these key areas again, perhaps with a slightly different emphasis. It's probably important to mention that these poems, which will be clear to everybody, were composed originally for a primarily wandering monastic audience. But they're essential teachings for each one of us, whether we're a monastic or whether we're a householder, a layperson. Even the passages that directly refer to monastic life or the homeless life can be seen in a deep way and can be applicable to each one of us. In fact, in another sutra, one of the Buddha's senior disciples, Mahakaccayana, was commenting on a verse describing the behavior of a person who has left home, who has become a wandering monastic. And in that commentary, Mahakaccayana interprets the word home as meaning the five skandhas of form, feeling, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, and society as sense impressions. So we can see even from that example that that verse has also an internal meaning that can apply to each one of us. So I invite you, as we go through this text, if you feel like, oh, this text is speaking to a particular audience or a particular person, please go a little bit more deeply, because there are lessons in each one of these verses that each one of us can discover. And they're the gift that keeps giving. Each time we look at these verses and we consider them, we discover something new. So let's have a little look at the first text, the first poem that we'll look at this for these next 2 weeks, which is the KamaSutta, the Discourse on Desire. The Book of Eights begins with the first poem, which is a teaching on sidestepping desire, greed and craving, this sense of thirst, this sense of lack. In this first poem, of course, there's an acknowledgement, an awareness that when we gain the object that we're looking for, the object of our desire, it can be a joy. But at the same time, this poem underlines the insight that this pleasure and joy, at best, can only be fleeting and ultimately will be unsatisfactory. We have this quite deep tendency to cling on to 4 things, which we mentioned earlier, and mistake them for true security, since they're often the ways in which we define ourselves and our experience. So the first of these things is sense impressions. The second one is attachment to views. This is quite a big one. The third is usually translated as rites and rituals, like outer rites and rituals. And when we hear that phrase, often we think of religious observances, which I shared about earlier, religious practices. And that's one perfectly valid interpretation. But there's another aspect of this as well, a deeper aspect perhaps, that's applicable to those of us who may not be coming from a monastic background. And this can be looking at this aspect as being attached and entrenched into our habitual modes of thinking and behaving. And the fourth is concepts of who we are, concepts of who we are, ourself, or selfing, the beloved Holy Trinity that each one of us has, the Holy Trinity of I, me, and my. So these 4 areas are considered within this text, and also by its blossoming from seed form into later developments in Buddhism, to be 4 ways in which we constantly feed our own cycle of dissatisfaction, repeated dissatisfaction, this cycle that we call samsara. In the Discourse on the 8 Realizations of Great Beings, which is another sutra that I love so much from the Mahayana tradition, there's a sentence that reads, all hardships in daily life arise from greed and desire. And this is definitely the framework that's presented in this first poem. Given this background, if we wish to transform our suffering, if we really want to transform our situation, then it's important for each of us to identify these 4 areas within ourselves, not just conceptually, like the idea of rites and rituals or attachment to views and self and so on, but really to see how these manifest in our life. Even in a small way, we start to recognize them. And by recognizing them, we start to see their patterns and how they feed our situation of repeated dissatisfaction. So as I mentioned earlier as well, there are some strong images given in this poem. They're quite evocative. So here it is. And I'm indebted, as we go through these series of talks, to Venerable Thanissaro Bhikkhu and also Gil Fronsdal and Venerable Sujato of Sutta Central, all who have great translations of these texts. So the Discourse on Desire, the KamaSutta. If one, longing for sensual pleasure, achieves it, certainly they're enraptured at heart. We mortals get what we want. But when for that person who is longing and desiring the pleasures diminish, they're shattered, as if shot with an arrow. Sidestepping sensual desire, as one would avoid stepping on the head of a snake with one's foot, is the mindful one who, while in this very world, steps beyond craving. Through greed for fields, goods, gold, cows, and horses, servants, relatives, and many other sensual pleasures, one's own weakness overpowers. Crushed by many troubles, pain invades as water into a cracked boat. A person, ever mindful, therefore turns away from sensual desires. Releasing them, one crosses the flood, like one who, bailing a boat, has reached the other shore. So this evening, since we spent some time with just an overview of the Book of Eights, this evening we'll spend just a short period of time going through briefly this text to set the tone. Also, since we've covered a lot of these themes in recent talks, so I'll just bring out a few threads of this text this evening for you to continue exploring over the next 2 weeks. I invite you to read this text, reflect on it, and reflect on your own experience that arises as you read this text and you explore how you relate to some of the things that are shared in this text. So the first part of the poem, if one longing for sensual pleasure achieves it, yes, they're enraptured at heart. We mortals get what we want. But when for that person who is longing and desiring the pleasures diminish, they're shattered as if shot by an arrow. So kama, which we usually translate as sensual desire and is the name of this poem, the KamaSutta, occurs 6 times in this poem. And there are 3 interrelated meanings. One is desire in general, just general desire, this general sense of lack and its associated sense of search. And then desire for specific sense pleasures. And then the third is the desire for the objects of sense pleasure. So the early Buddhist attitude towards objects of sense pleasure is quite clear in this poem. This poem, this very first poem of the Book of Eights clearly falls into the letting go camp, the practice of letting go of this sense of lack, this sense of search. Letting go, as we explored in the last talk that we had together, is quite different from avoidance. Avoiding something can be only ever temporary at best. It's, in a sense, it can lead into a form of neuroticism. Letting go, quite differently to avoiding, as we explored in the last talk, is a deep spiritual practice of leaving behind with no more nostalgia, no more little sense of just waiting to pick it up again, but the sense of like it's done for us. This first poem of the collection is a clear example of sharing in a very pithy and brief form the way in which early Buddhist practitioners viewed the pleasures of the senses. The KamaSutta shows us clearly that the Buddha didn't deny the objects of pleasure or tell us that we should sit around reciting suffering, suffering, suffering all day long. But what the Buddha discovered was that sense pleasures are not really pleasurable in any lasting sense. This verse offers the Buddhist perspective that pleasure, or in Pali language, asada, cannot be permanent, not only due to the impermanent nature of its object, the fact that the object of our desire is always changing, but the fact that we too are always in a process of change. So here the Buddha doesn't deny the reality that sense pleasures are pleasurable, are wonderful. In fact, the Buddha often pointed out that there are beautiful and pleasing sense objects, but he always reminds us to remember and to inscribe onto our hearts that these things are impermanent and are not lasting. The insight, the Buddhist insight of what we call the Tri Lakshana, the three marks of existence, the three marks of phenomena, helps us to see that all phenomena, physical and mental, have this sense of impermanence, this sense of constantly changing. This can, again, be a very scary thing or a very wonderful thing. Our teacher Tejas told us that if we truly understood impermanence, if we're truly able to see impermanence, we would celebrate it. Impermanence makes all things possible. In fact, he said that we would say, "Long live impermanence." It's a wonderful thing, because thanks to impermanence, transformation is possible. The Kamasutra, this first poem, reminds us that when we get entangled in sense pleasures, when we define ourselves by these sense pleasures in some way, mistaking them for real happiness, we will become like a person who's pierced by an arrow when these pleasures, by their very nature, change or disappear. The Buddha and Buddhism in general differs very radically from most other teachers in pointing out that what others call happiness or freedom is viewed by the Buddha and the noble ones or wise ones as suffering. In fact, in one of the commentaries, this sense of the inherent pain that underlies our habitual relationship towards sense pleasures or objects of our sense is a little like, and it's a strong image, licking honey from a razor blade. It's very sweet, but sooner or later, if we're not careful, there's going to be a cut that will occur. So we continue on with the poem, sidestepping sensual desire. As one would avoid stepping on the head of a snake with one's foot, is the mindful one who, while in this very world, steps beyond craving. So a dangerous snake here is used to represent this tendency towards sensual desire, towards defining ourselves by the objects of our sensual desire. And we see this image in a number of texts in the Buddhist canon, such as the Sutra on the Knowing the Better Way to Catch a Snake, which you can read in the Plum Village Chanting and Recitation book, and other texts as well. We read a very compelling phrase in this particular section of the poem. It says, right in this very world. So here in this text, we have this sense of non-duality, of the fact that liberation, of freedom, is to be touched right here and right now, right in this very world, in this moment, in this very world where you find yourself. You might be sitting at home, you might be at work, you might be in any number of places, but right in that very world. And the world here is not only the world outside, but the world inside. So the world of this current mind state that you find yourself in is where we are to find our way to be able to touch this peace that's spoken of in the text. There's a saying coming out of the Tiantai tradition that a small practitioner, a very small practitioner, needs to go and live on the top of a mountain. But the greatest practitioner achieves their liberation right in the heart of the marketplace. So right in this very world, in the very situation that you find yourself, is in the sense of this verse, it is the perfect place. It is the very best place. Even if there's a number of circumstances that are challenging for us, that it is, within the context of this verse, the very place that we find ourselves is our marketplace, is our place of liberation, if we know how to use it well, if we know how to encounter it well. Then we continue on. One's own weakness overpowers. Crushed by many troubles, dukkha, suffering and pain invades as water leaks into a cracked boat. So one's own weakness. This is interesting, isn't it? In this verse, we don't hear about all the problems of the world outside, and that we don't hear about the samsara outside. We hear about our own weakness. And so this is an invitation for each one of us, again, to take that sense of responsibility, to look at the ways in which we co-create a situation of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness. And the water pouring into a leaking boat signifies the way in which this continual sense of lack, this greed or this craving, brings about the trouble and suffering. Crossing over, the metaphor of crossing over the shore of suffering and the shore of liberation is a metaphor that occurs so many times in Buddhism. It's one way to understand this spiritual path, this spiritual practice, this metaphor of us standing on a shore that we call the shore of suffering, filled with pain and dissatisfaction. And that each of us is to build for ourselves a raft of the teachings and practices that can help us to transform the individual and collective shore of suffering that we find ourselves on. And so then we build ourselves this raft, and we make this journey of crossing over the flood. We make the journey of 1,000 years, 10,000 years, and longer, or we make the journey of crossing over to the other shore of a split second, not only once, but many times over. And we arrive at this shore that we call the shore of liberation. And perhaps we get to the shore and we pull ourselves up and we stand up, and then we notice something quite strange. That we're standing on the shore of liberation, but it is in fact the same place that we were when we embarked on our journey. It is the same as the shore of suffering, but everything has changed. Everything has changed. A person ever mindful, therefore turns away from sensual desires. Releasing them, one crosses the flood, like one who, bailing out water from a boat, has reached the other shore. So in the context of this verse, we see that it's only by bailing out the water, of seeing our tendency towards lack and craving and defining ourselves by external objects for what it is, of grasping on to people and situations and ideas and entrenched behaviors for what they are, that we can cross over these floods to the safety of the other shore. Notice that we're not invited to fix the boat. That would be our tendency, wouldn't it? To think, well, the boat is leaking, let's fix the boat. Here we're asked to bail out the water. There's a sense here that this situation of the leaky boat is inherent in our human condition. And that within the context of this verse, safety doesn't come about from fixing the leaky boat, because even if the boat itself is fixed, the boat's still in rough and dangerous waters. It's still caught in the flood. Instead, safety here in the context of this verse is found by going beyond the floods. This metaphor of crossing over as the spiritual journey occurs about 5 times in the text, the Book of Eights. In this first time, in this first verse that we encounter this metaphor, it's linked to a sense of safety, a sense of security. And it seems kind of appropriate because the whole framework of this first verse is a framework in which we have been grasping after this false sense of security by the ways in which we latch onto, we hold on to behaviors or sense impressions or ideas as a security or a security blanket. But our real security, our real safety is quite different in the context of Buddhist practice and in the context of this verse specifically. So about crossing over and about the flood, in Buddhism, the flood itself is considered to be fourfold. In this metaphor, the flood that lies between the shore of suffering and the shore of liberation. The first is called kamoga. A flood is an oga, and here we have kamoga, the same root word kama, sensual desire. Being pulled in 1,000 directions by our senses is one of those floods. The stimuli and the habitual response is that one flood. Most of the time we don't notice the inputs, and I think most of us can relate to feeling like we're being barraged by sense impressions at many points. The second is bhavoga, the flood of becoming. This dissatisfaction and sense of lack, this sense that we need to become something else, something other than what we are. This sense that we don't have enough conditions. And so it leads into the sense of wanting to accumulate so many things over and over again. The third is the flood of views, dittoga. Ditti is view, so dittoga, the flood of views. As Tay has shared with us in the heart of the Buddha's teaching, Buddhism is not here to give us a whole new set of views, but to release us from the prison of views. And if there was ever a phrase that would sum up one of the main themes of the Book of Eights, that's it. That Buddhism isn't here to give us a whole new set of views, but to release us from the prison of views. So the flood of views. And all of us have so many views. And then the fourth is avijjoga, which is ignorance, the flood of ignorance. So in the KamaSutta, in the Discourse on Desire, you'll notice that there's no claim of some kind of ultimate state. Instead, in the context of this first verse, the motivation, the aspiration, the intentionality for letting go is the wish to become safe from danger, of seeing our situation, of seeing how we're floating around here and there, flitting here and there, and wanting to be safe from that danger. So dear community, I hope that you're sharing my interest and my excitement with the beginning part of the Book of Eights, and that you've discovered a few wonderful things in this particular poem that we're looking at this evening. Over the next couple of weeks, I invite you to spend some time every day to look at this first poem. We'll be posting it in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha Facebook group for you to be able to refer to and look at. And perhaps we can discuss it in the Sangha and look at it together. But most importantly, sit with it every day and see what it has to say to you. And perhaps we can continue our practice with looking at this sense of lack, this sense of desire in its three aspects. This, as we've spoken of quite recently, this sense of sensual desire, of becoming, and of getting rid of. So dear community, I want to thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed the talk this evening. Let's come back to our breathing, come back to our bodies, and we'll enjoy a sound of the bell to close this evening's sharing.